Mr. Greedy. Mr. Greedy liked to eat. In fact, Mr. Greedy loved to eat, and the more he ate, the better he became. And the trouble was, the better he became, the more hungry he became. And the more hungry he became, the more he ate, and the more he ate, the better he became. And so it went on. You can see pink Mr. Greedy is greedy and looking greedy. Mr. Greedy lived in a house that looked rather like himself. It was a roly-poly sort of house. Well, the house is roly-poly sort of. Oh, it looks like it's going to eat me. One morning, Mr. Greedy woke rather earlier than usual. He'd been dreaming of food as usual, and that made him wake up feeling hungry as usual. So Mr. Greedy got up, went downstairs, and ate the most enormous breakfast. Whoa, he's looking greedy even if he is asleep. This is what Mr. Greedy had for his breakfast. Toast, 2 slices, cornflakes, 1 packet, milk, 1 bottle, sugar, 1 bowlful, toast, 3 slices, eggs, 3 boiled, toast, 4 slices, butter, 1 dish, marmalade, 1 pot. And here is 3 boiled eggs. This is it looks quite big because it's Mr. Greedy's breakfast. When he had finished his enormous breakfast, Mr. Greedy sat back in his chair, smiled with a very satisfied smile, and thought, "That was a delicious breakfast," he thought to himself. "Now I wonder what would be nice to have for lunch." He decided in order to work up an appetite for lunch, he would go for a long walk. He'd look even more hungrier than usual if he ate before. The morning Mr. Greedy walked and walked and walked. Then he discovered a cave. "That's funny," he thought. "I don't remember seeing that there before." He's quite small in this picture, but he looking greedy alright. Mr. Greedy, being curious, a sort of a barrel, decided to explore. He entered a dark cave. Inside, he discovered some giant steps leading upwards. Mr. Greedy, being a curious sort of a fellow, decided to climb them. They were very steep and very difficult to climb, but with much hopping and popping, Mr. Greedy climbed up and up. Whoa, Mr. Greedy is huge, but the stair is huger. At the top of the steps, Mr. Greedy came to a door. It was, without doubt, the biggest door that Mr. Greedy had ever seen, and it wasn't quite shut. Mr. Greedy, being a curious sort of a fellow, decided to see what was on the other side of that door. So Mr. Greedy squeezed himself through the crack in the door, and there before him was an amazing sight. The biggest room in the world! Well, Mr. Greedy is a greedy person, but seeing him on the biggest room in the world, he is kind of cute. The floor was as big as a field. The table in the middle of the floor was as big as a house, and the chairs around it were as high as the trees. Mr. Greedy felt very small. Then he sniffed. Something from somewhere up on the top of the gigantic table was the most delicious booty smell that Mr. Greedy had ever smelled. Well, here he is, looking up at the table to see where the booty scent came from. Mr. Greedy sniffed again and then decided that he must get up on the table, so he began to climb off the leg of the enormous chair. It was very difficult to took him a long time, but eventually Mr. Greedy stood on the table. Everything was larger than life. The salt and pepper pots was both bigger than the pillar boxes. Well, the salt and pepper pot must be big because Mr. Greedy is huge. There was a bowl of fruit on the table, and Mr. Greedy tried to leave one of the oranges. Oh, he's so tiny. And Mr. Greedy, being Mr. Greedy, took a bite out of one of the apple there. Then he looked around. Well, this is a tiny bite, but this is thieving. Over on the other side of the table stood the source of that delicious smell, a huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal plate, and on the plate, huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal sausages and the size of hellos, a huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal potatoes on the size of meatballs, and huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal peas the size of cabbages. Mr. Greedy hurried across the table towards the plate, and being Mr. Greedy, began to eat. Stop, thief! Suddenly a shadow fell over the plate, and Mr. Greedy found himself being picked up by a giant hand, looking at the eyes of a little live giant. And who, thundered the giant, are you? Mr. Greedy was so frightened that he could only just manage to squeak his voice. Mr. Greedy? He squeaked. The giant laughed a laugh as louder as a thunder. Greedy by name and greedy by nature, he bellowed. Well, I think, Mr. Greedy, that you need to taught a lesson. I told you to stop thieving, Mr. Greedy. And what a lesson it was. The giant made Mr. Greedy eat up everything on the huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal plate. When he had finished, Mr. Greedy felt very ill indeed, as if he could burst at any minute. Now, said the giant in a much quieter voice, do you promise never to be greedy again? Yes, moaned Mr. Greedy. I promise. Oh, the giant is a very kind giant. If I was him, I could have eat you, Mr. Greedy. Very well, said the giant. Then I'll let you go. Mr. Greedy climbed down the table and went out through the door, feeling very fat and extremely miserable. Poor Mr. Greedy. He cannot be greedy ever again. And do you know, from that day to this, Mr. Greedy had kept his promise. And do you know something else as well? Mr. Greedy doesn't look like he used to look anymore. Mr. Greedy doesn't look, he now looks like this, which I think suits him a lot better, don't you? So if you know anybody who's as greedy as Mr. Greedy used to be, you know what to tell them, don't you? Beware of giants. The end. Thank you for watching this video.